Is that on now? I ran out of time yesterday, unfortunately. So I want to get some practical lessons out of chapter 1, and one of the things that that Jason asked us to do in our lessons was do what? Is that not on? Slide it up. Now, is that any better? It's what? Let you check your hearing aid. Well, it's at one end or the other. My voice is still a little bit rough, and doing the best I can to nurse this thing. And I'm sure that all of you who are preachers have been in the same situation, but we struggle with that from time to time. As I was mentioning, there's some lessons that I some lessons from chapter 1 that I think are worthy of taking the time to present, and then we'll get right on into chapter 2. But Jason had asked us in our presentation, in our lessons, and in our presentation to be forceful on distinctive doctrines and things that exalt Christ and make us somewhat different. I guess you could just yell in different places. I remember the story of a little boy that went with his daddy to try out for a preaching job, and as they were going to lunch, the preacher, the elder there asked the boy, says, is that your daddy's favorite sermon? And he said, oh no. He said, that's the only sermon he's got. He just yells in different places. So, but let me share with you some lessons that we have from chapter 1. There's much to be learned about Paul's apostleship. The most distinctive aspect of Paul's teaching was that it was through the will of God. And he spends an entire chapter, almost an entire chapter, in the book of Galatians upholding his apostleship because his critics were saying that he was a latecomer. He was not with Peter and John and James. And so when he makes the statement that it is through the will of God, he's putting the divine stamp of approval on his apostleship. And when he wrote to the Corinthians, you will remember that he said, the things that I write unto you, they are the commandments of the Lord. And I'm sure that you have had circumstances in which you've had people basically just shun the Bible, particularly those parts they don't like. But when they do so, they're shunning God's representative. And whether we do it intentionally or by lack of application to the truth being taught, you're still doing the same thing, are you not? Number 2, if we plant the seed, it will bear fruit. And that's reiterated several times in chapter 1. I think it's curious when you look at the life of Christ that there are 3 occasions when Jesus uses this phrase, the fields are white unto harvest. One of them was when he was teaching the Samaritan woman, and his disciples came back after trying to find something to eat, and not only did they find him conversing with a Samaritan, but with a Samaritan woman at that. And Jesus says, lift up your eyes, the fields are white unto harvest. The second time was when Jesus sent out his disciples, and he says, you're going out like sheep into the midst of wolves, and you will be persecuted. And yet, he said the fields are white unto harvest. The third time was when he crossed the Jordan and went over into Decapolis, and the soil over there was not the best in the world. You had Gentiles mixed with unfaithful Jews, and yet Jesus again said to his disciples, the fields are white unto harvest. I think sometimes we lose our grip on the power of the gospel. And we seem to say something to this effect, well, nobody listens anymore, or nobody's interested, or the soil's not good. Jesus could see the good soil in the midst of bad circumstances. And so if we'll just keep planting the seed, somewhere down the road, that seed is going to take effect. The parable of the sower was basically that of getting the seed in the ground, and you let God take care of giving the increase. Don't get frustrated if it's not as fast as we would like for it to be. Number 3, God expects His children to walk worthily of the Lord. That means faith and obedience combined. We have a sacred obligation of living holy lives. Passages like 2 Corinthians chapter 6 come out from among them. Be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch no unclean thing, and I will be to you a father, and you shall be to me sons and daughters. But we have an obligation of walking worthily of the Lord. In verse 13, there's a process that takes place in verse 13. But let me put both of these up here. We've been delivered out of the power of darkness and translated into the kingdom of the Son of His love. Translated into, and so you have coming out of something and going into something. And it's sort of like the parable that Jesus told of the spirits that possess the man, and after those spirits had gone out and they were clean, that the spirits came back into the man. The great obligation we have is that as we strive to live the Christian life, that we get the evil things out, but we put something into our life in order to make it useful to God. Think about this phrase also, delivered out of the power of darkness. There's great power in ignorance. I think the word is being used here in contrast to knowledge. So there's a stark contrast between knowing the things that are right and knowing the things that are evil and wrong. Number 6, as creator of all things, Jesus is preeminent over all power and authority. Don't ever forget that the creator is the one who tells the created how to adequately approach the creator and not the other way around. My son came in to me when he was living at home and he was in high school, and he wanted to do something, and I just told him no. I didn't have time to explain to him, and yet he kept pressing me, well, why can't I? And I said those words that I said I would never say, because I said so. And then I felt I needed to explain myself, and I said, let me ask you a question. Who is in the better position to evaluate whether what you are wanting to engage in is wise or not? You who have been around for, let's say, 16 years, now a teenager, or the parent who's been around double that. And obviously, he said, well, you are. It's the same thing with God and man. God is the creator, man is the created. And it seems to me that our approach to the Bible ought to be something like this: God, you speak and I will listen. But most people take this approach. They say, God, I'm going to devise a worship that I like and expect you to accept it. That's not an exaltation of the supremacy of Christ. That is putting self on the throne instead of putting God on the throne. And then number 7, and I just put this, we have been reconciled. Now just think about that for a minute. I like the words of John in 1 John 3 when he said that we're called the children of God, and we are. It's as if John is saying it's a wonderful blessing to be called the children of God, and we are. There's just some things that ought to astound us, But reconciliation is the idea of bridging a gap between two parties that have been separated, and it's always in the biblical relationship, it's always man that has been separated from God by man's sin. It's not It's not the other way around. It is that man chooses to separate from God. And that word reconciliation is a wonderful word to reconcile or to bring back together again. So those are some lessons from chapter 1. Here's the one more. Christ is the head of the church, and there's something in a name. I was in a conversation with a couple of missionaries from Australia when I was doing work in South Africa, and we had come in contact with a young married couple, and so we decided to go into their home and study. And they wanted to know if they could bring their preachers, and we said yes. And their concept was, well, let's put all of our resources together, and we'll double our efforts. So when their preachers got there, I said, well, it's a noble concept to be able to be united into one, but there's no way that I could fellowship you because of the varying doctrines that we disagree on. And they said something to the effect, well, like what? And I said, well, take just the name, for example. You call yourself the Church of the Brethren. I said, but there's no designation like that in the pages of the New Testament. It's not the Brethren's church, it's Christ's church. And their names were George and John, and John said something to the effect, well, there's nothing in a name anyway. And so I began to play on his name. His name was John. The other guy's name was George. And I said, well, George, let me get you to think about what you just said. And he said, no, I'm John. I said, he's George. And I said, well, that's fine, George, no problem. And I just consistently used the other guy's name. I just kept calling him George. And I don't know if he ever picked up on that. He finally got so frustrated, and he said, can't you understand that I am George and that I'm John and this is George? And I said, I understand that, George, perfectly, but you said there's nothing in a name. I don't think he ever got the point. I don't think he ever did. All right, let's move into chapter 2 then. We started out yesterday, and we had looked at chapter 1, 2 through 6. The doctrine of Christ's preeminence is declared. It was announced by Paul in the writing itself. It's carried out by the preaching. And so now number 2, the second point is that there are dangers that face the church in every generation. And so Christ's preeminence needs to be defended. And I mentioned yesterday some of the false teachers that were more prominent in Colossae. The Gnostics were probably much like our pluralistic philosophers today. They'll say something to the effect, there's no absolute truth, and if you're not a part of our group, you can't grasp it anyway. Of course, the Judaizers were those that mixed Judaism and Christianity together, trying to lessen the force of Christianity. And I mentioned yesterday that Christianity and anything else never does mix. If you try to mix it, you've always lost. Antinomians are those that are opposed to law, and then philosophers are those who are very philosophical in their thinking. The word philosophers has the idea of love of wisdom, as we'll see here in a minute. But I want you to think about some passages that address all of these. It doesn't make any difference what group you're dealing with. These are admonitions that cover the whole spectrum. Matthew 5:17, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing. Inwardly they're like ravening wolves. Romans 16, 17, and 18. I beseech you, brethren, mark them that are causing the divisions and occasions of stumbling contrary to the doctrine which you learned, and turn away from them, for they are such who serve not our Lord Jesus, but their own belly, and their smooth and fair speech they beguile the hearts of the innocent. I've always been somewhat amazed at how smooth the false teachers can be. And they use very persuasive language, and Paul's going to address that very thing in a few minutes in this section that we're studying right now. Galatians 1, 8 and 9, but though we or an angel from heaven should preach to you any gospel other than that which we have preached, you let him be anathema. 2 Peter 2, 1. There arose false prophets who among the people are among you also, that there shall be teachers who shall privily bring in destructive heresies, denying even the master that brought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. Jude 3. These are passages that you're familiar with. And it's not like the false teachers came in and caught the apostles unaware. It is that God expected these things to be. So don't get terribly upset or shocked if when you move into a community and those who are teaching error, they raise their heads and they start opposing you. They don't have to be outside the church. They can be inside the church as well. And the more forceful and strong you are in your preaching, the sooner they're going to rear their heads in rebellion against what you're saying. Occasionally it doesn't take very long at all. So Jude was writing about false teachers who had come. 2 Peter was talking about the false teachers who would come. Here's the three major sections in this chapter. Christ's preeminence needs to be defended from the empty philosophies, the enslaving legalism, and the egotistical asceticism. Let's look at each one of these. Let's define philosophy. It's a combination in your Greek word, philosophia. We sometimes say there are three different words for love. Agape love, which is the deepest love, and then you have phileo love, which it's more like kindly affection. You have storge love, which is the love between fathers and children. It's natural love. And then you have eros love, which is the intimacy between a husband and a wife. The two most common words, in fact, I don't even think eros love appears in the New Testament, but the two most common words that are translated love in our English translation is the word agape and the word phileo. And here is a form of that word phileo. So the apostle combines this when he says it is the love, a kindly affection for wisdom. Now, you have to understand this is the wisdom of the world that Paul is talking about here. It's the wisdom of the world. Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 2 for just a minute. When Paul started writing to the church at Corinth, early on in this letter, he picks up the contrast between the wisdom of the world versus the wisdom that God had to give. You could even go back into chapter 1, but I want to start looking at verse 1, chapter 2, verse 1, and here's what Paul writes. And I, brethren, when I came unto you, came not with excellency of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God, for I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. We speak wisdom as opposed to the world. We speak wisdom, however, among them that are full grown, but it's not a wisdom of this world. So you see, you're getting this sharp contrast between the wisdom of the world and the wisdom that comes from heaven. James did the same thing. He said we ought to seek for that wisdom that is heavenly, that is from above and not from the earth. And yet you look around us today, the vast majority of the human race are seeking earthly wisdom, a wisdom that sort of sets them up and exalts them. And all of these are opposed to Christ. Here's what Thayer says about this word wisdom. It's used either of zeal or skill in any art or science, any branch of knowledge used once in the New Testament of the theology or rather theosophy of certain Jewish ascetics, which busied itself with refined speculative inquiries into the nature of classes of angels, into the ritual of the Mosaic law and the regulators of Jewish tradition respecting practical life. And it's astounding to me. Later on, he's going to talk about the rudiments of the flesh. There's an interesting word. The rudiments of the flesh are like you're setting, rudiments of anything. You're setting things up and counting 1, 2, 3. You're following a distinct order. And people get so mesmerized with these things. Genealogies, for example. You can go to Salt Lake City, Utah, and I've been there. I've been in their library where they're searching genealogical records. And I mean, it's every bit as big as the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And those halls are packed with people going through these files. No doubt they're all on computer now and looking for genealogical records. They're so attached to that. My mom and my daughter got off into searching out genealogical records, and I asked her a couple of weeks ago when I was at my mom's funeral, I said, Janice, are you still doing that? She said, no, I can tell you, Dad, it's an endless thing. It's endless. So why are people so mesmerized by that? Well, it catches their attention. It's wisdom of the world again. But let's go a little bit further. If you were to think about this word wisdom from a standpoint, somebody once said philosophy is like a blind man going into a dark cellar looking for a black cat that isn't there. That's a pretty good definition of human philosophy. But somebody else came along and they said, but the difference between philosophy and theology is that theology finds the cat. Now, I would agree with that to some extent, but I think you get the point they're trying to make. Philosophy is an addiction to the way the world thinks as they seek the mysteries of the universe in which we live. I'm going to do this. I've put the verses up here, verses 8 through 10. And we're going to look at 3 words here that'll help us see that this is something that plagued the Colossians. And as I mentioned yesterday, this is a great way to study. You just go through and you isolate words that you try to find are hinge words. But listen to Paul's words here. Take heed lest there be anyone that maketh a spoil of you through his philosophy. And I've highlighted some of these: his philosophy, his vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. So the origin of these philosophies is human in its nature. It's not heavenly. It's focused upon the things of this world, and they carry it to varying degrees, as we'll see. Now, go through the verse again and think about the outcome of this. And Paul says, take heed lest there shall be anyone that makes spoil of you through his philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. And so the outcome of human wisdom is it spoils you, your Christian faith. And right here is an indication, if not a very forceful statement, that your faith in Christ can be overturned by the philosophies of the world. How many people have we known, for example, who have gotten great degrees in prestigious universities, and it wasn't long until they started changing their preaching and turning away from the teachings of God's Word? I think of men like Rubel Shelley and Rick Brumback and others who, not Joseph Metter, no, it wasn't Rick Brumback, Joseph Metter. These people who got great education, and then no pun intended here, but it went to their head, you know. So the outcome, I get a distinct impression this was a real danger in Corinth. But now, what really is the danger in this? It is that it presents an opposition to the exaltation of Christ. Go through the verse again and pick up this phrase down there in the middle of the next, down in the middle of the 8th verse and on into the 9th verse. After the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. For in him dwelleth the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and in him you are made full. You don't need the extra things of this world and the philosophies of this world in order to make you full. How many times has it been said over the years, the man who has a poor education but he knows his Bible is a whole lot closer to God than the man who has the greatest education the world can offer, but he doesn't know God. It's a stark difference in the two. So you have the origin. It comes from their philosophy, their vain deceit, traditions of men. Outcome is that it spoils you. Apostasy is a real and present danger. I debated a denominational preacher some years ago. Actually, the debate was on faith and baptism, and he wanted to get off into apostasy for some reason. So I followed his lead a little bit in one of the speeches, and I started answering, and he got real uncomfortable with that. He didn't want to pursue that. But it is a real apostasy. A real problem. Okay, so let's look at the next one. That's empty philosophies, and the second one is enslaving legalism. I guess I need to take a minute and try to define what I mean by legalism. That's a term that is bandied about. There's intended to be a negative connotation on this, because as you pressed for obedience to the Word, you're going to have some people who respond by saying, you're too legalistic. Now, here's what they often mean by that, though they know not what they say. They often mean that if you stress obedience to every command instead of stressing the spirit of the law, then you become a legalist. So how do you define legalism? And it's so misused in our society today. Is it the same thing as Phariseeism? You remember in chapter 23 where Jesus rebuked the Pharisees because of their ritualistic laws binding the very smallest of details. And yet, when I look at Matthew 23 and verse 3, here's what Jesus said to the multitudes and to his disciples. He said, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. All things, therefore, whatsoever they bid you, these do and observe, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. They were being rebuked because of their hypocrisy and not because of their stress on stringent obedience to the law. Look, if stringent obedience to the law is what constitutes legalism, I'm going to suggest to you that you, by implication, are saying that Jesus was a legalist, that Paul was a legalist. Jesus himself said, if you love me, you'll do what? You'll keep my commandments. I refer back to that debate that I had with that denominational preacher, and I kept trying to stress to him, is baptism a command to be obeyed? And finally, I think it was in the last night of the debate or the next to last night, he said, it is a command, but you don't have to obey it to be saved. And I said to my audience there, I said, will you listen to what he just said? He's saying, here is a command, but you don't have to obey it. Since when does man have the prerogative of taking a command of God? I don't care if it's the command on baptism to become a Christian, or whether it is to bring your life into harmony with God's Word in anything. You can't pick and choose. And yet that's precisely what so many have done in our society today, even within the church. Are we not having the same problem when people choose what they're going to do with regard to marriage and divorce? This concept of contemporary worship and, what's the other one, traditional worship. We've got contemporary and traditional worship. Who do they think they're fooling? That's already a divisive issue. Who do they think they're fooling? I don't think it's Phariseeism. I can rule that out because of the importance that God himself puts upon obedience. Jason's not down here holding my time. I think I'm supposed to quit at a quarter after. You timing me? Okay. I'm going to have to hurry. Okay, is it strict obedience to the command of God that's legalism? Is it the following of a pattern? Of course, Matthew 5 and verse 20, what did Jesus say? Except your righteousness exceed that of the Pharisees. So it's not strict obedience to the commands that is legalism, nor is it following after a pattern. And we went through a period here, 10 years or so, people were ridiculing what they called pattern theology. Well, I'll be frank with you, I like the concept of pattern theology because it says to me, God has plainly spoken and I am to come into line with what he tells me. It's a pattern for my life. Colossians 3:17, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 5, God said to Moses, the things that were shown you in the mount, you be sure to keep those things. Now try to think about this for a minute. If there's no pattern that's available to us, and God doesn't care how I go about worshiping him or organizing the church, you mean to tell me that Moses had to follow a strict pattern in the Old Testament practice, but somehow when we get to the better covenant, God says to man, now you just do it the way you want? I mean, that doesn't make sense. I sometimes think people just don't use their thinking cap. Webster's Comprehensive Dictionary has 2 or 3 thoughts about this concept of legalism. It's close adherence to the law, strict conformity to the law. It would include that. It's the tendency to observe the letter rather than the spirit of the law. You see, it's hard to take his definition and get people to understand the biblical concept. This comes from a website at www.BibleStudyTools.com. That's a denominational website. I found it interesting that this fellow has a better concept of legalism than some of my own brethren. I'd be curious to see how he applies it. But he said traditions are likely the most common inside the realm of legalism, most common type of legalism, inside the realm of legalism. Every church has certain traditions that would incite heresy if they were altered. Another source of legalism is preferred preferences, personal preferences, or convictions. In other words, we're going to do things my way or no way, and they get all upset if you want to change the approach to things. This happens when an individual enforces their personal convictions as a requirement for salvation and spiritual growth. And then lastly, we find Christians promoting their personal views on the gray areas of life. Now, I know, I mean, these fellas in the denominational world, more often than not, they're not consistent in the application of this. But these fellows, that's a good definition and concept of legalism. Let me tell you the position that Roy Deaver and Tom Warren used to hold with regard to what is legalism and what is liberalism. You take a mountain, and at the peak of that mountain, that's the mountaintop of truth. That is right there on the top of the peak. And everything that goes off to the left, that's liberalism. And everything that goes off to the right is legalism. But to be more refined, that goes off to the left is loosing where God has not loosed. And legalism then, just by the very definition of it, we're looking at opposites here, by the very definition then needs to mean binding where God has not bound. That's legalism. You take the book of Galatians, this is a fascinating study in Galatians, where basically what Paul is doing is he's trying to get the Galatian brethren to quit putting their focus on law keeping. It's not what you believe in, it's who you believe in. And we've got the same problem today among members of the church. Their focus is not on who saves us, but their focus is on what saves me. And I think that's part of the problem that comes out of this. And I'm not questioning everybody who says, I'd like to be rebaptized. Well, why? Well, I just don't think I did it right. And you inquire, and they did do it right, but they still want to do it right. I had a sister in Christ called me years ago, and she said, I need to be rebaptized. She wasn't a member there at the Hanley congregation where I was preaching then, but she wanted to be rebaptized. And I said, why? She said, well, down there is where I was baptized when I was a little girl, and I want to do it again. I said, did you believe in Jesus? Yes. Did you confess the name of Jesus? But I just want to be baptized again. What was she putting her trust in? And we have the same mindset when people think something along this line that I can't seem to do enough to serve God. You're not going to do enough to serve God. You can't. It's not possible. But you take your love in your heart for Him, and you do all that you can because you love Him. Now, was it a problem in Colossae? Well, look at this. There were evidently certain elements in there who were pressing circumcision. They were somewhat off on the bond written in ordinances. That would have been the law of Moses. And look at verse 16. In this context of the law of Moses, let no man judge you in meat or in drink or in a feast day or a new moon or a Sabbath day, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is Christ. So it was a problem in Corinth, this legalistic mentality of binding laws, whether it's a Mosaic law or some other twisted perversion of it. The third thing is egotistical asceticism. That's a lifestyle characterized by abstinence from worldly pleasures, often for the purpose of pursuing spiritual goals. I just read a biography of Mahatma Gandhi, and he was a good example of asceticism to the maximum, denying himself of even some of the basic necessities for pursuing some goal. Was it an error in Colossae? Yeah, it was. Let no man rob you of your prize by a voluntary humility, worshiping of the angels, dwelling in things that which he hath seen. King James says, which he hath not seen. Different manuscripts produce that question in there. But whether it's things he's seen, in other words, he's putting his trust in what he can see, or whether it's things he has not seen, things that are not visible to the human eye, he was still dwelling in those things that he had no business getting off into, and not holding fast the head from the body. If you died with Christ, see all these, the rudiments of the world. Subject yourself to ordinances, handle not, taste not, touch not, after the precepts and doctrines of men, which things have indeed a shadow of wisdom and will worship. I mentioned yesterday that I've been to India, and these fellows in the Hindu festival week would beat themselves with ropes and all kinds of ascetic practices to show you how holy they are. And what is the fruit of that? What is the fruit of this asceticism? It'll rob you of your prize. It'll cause you to not hold fast to the head, which is, of course, Christ. And so you end up engaging in things that's material, that's physical things you won't handle, you won't touch. They all perish. But look at the last part of this. They are not of any value against the indulgence of the flesh. I'll close with this. I was reading Coney Barron-Howson's book on the life and epistles of St. Paul, and they do an amazing thing in their biography of Paul. They trace the life of Paul, and when he gets into a city, then they look at the letter he wrote, and they give you a brief commentary on that letter. So it's very, very brief. But here's an observation they made. When they came into Athens, they observed that the Athens were very, very religious. But morally speaking, that was a time of total moral depravity. Read Romans chapter 1. And it's a reminder that human wisdom, for whatever it's worth, human wisdom is not going to cause a man to become any more holy in his life. If anything, it's going to cause him to become worse. And so you can see the danger that they were having there in Corinth. I'm going to come back tomorrow, and as we did tonight, and I'll look at 2 or 3 lessons in this chapter before we get into chapter 2. Appreciate it very much. You got anything else to say?
No, we'll take a break. To the next lesson.
Okay, thank you.
I got it. Yes, sir. Sorry. I'm not even qualified to turn on the mic. Maybe not the only one who's not a doctor on the apologetics crew. I have enough Dr. Pepper in me, though. I think that qualifies. But hopefully what we can do this morning in this class is look at another branch of apologetics, or another way of proving things. And we're going to go to the divine origins of language this morning. I want to begin in Job chapter 38. Everybody turn to Job chapter 38. And I want you to notice the way that God reasons with Job in these passages. We're just going to read a few of these verses, but I just want to point out God's reasoning as he reasons with Job. So in Job 38, beginning verse 1, Job 38, beginning verse 1, he says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge?" And by the way, in chapter 42, Job's going to say, "It's me," and then he's going to put his hand over his mouth. But this is the way that God prefaces this conversation. And in verse 3, "Gird up now thy loins like a man." God doesn't have to prepare to answer. Man has to prepare to answer. So he's telling him, you need to get prepared to answer some questions. "For I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof?" Notice God's logical discussion here with Job. I think, first of all, he acknowledges and he points out the fact that creation is here. It's here. The mountains are here, the sky is here, the earth is here, creation is here. And so he begins by, okay, look around you, we're here, creation is here. And creation, therefore, and this creation also has an order. He's going to go into Job 38, how there's order within creation, and Ecclesiastes does the same thing. If creation here and there's an order to it, what God is trying to get Job to reason through is, if it wasn't me, then who did it? And this is God's logic with Job. If I'm not the one who put order into his creation and did it, then who did? Think about that, and this is what God's trying to get Job to think like, reason like a man, and go through this reasoning. If I didn't do it, then who did it? Here is, I think, the reasoning process for that. I don't know of anyone who is not in an asylum who would say that creation's not here, that man's not here. Now, of course, there's people who are, I don't know, loony. I'm not qualified, so I'll just use the word loony. Who perhaps would say we're not here. But most people, if you get in a conversation, they would acknowledge, well, we're here. And so if you start on the common ground of man is here, man's alive, man is here. If you start on that common ground. Now what God does with Job is all of creation, but we're just going to focus in on man. If man is here, we're going to say, we can all agree on that point, man is here, we're alive, we're here. So you have two options now. If we're here, your two options are either, I'm calling him the omni-God, the God who possesses all omni-traits, superlative traits, omniscience, omnipresence, etc. Either, option one, God made us, made man since we're here. Or option number two, something other than God made us. That's why we're here. So we're calling that option two, B2, being two. I'm just calling it B2 to represent this other being. It could be an angel, it could be a natural process, like evolution, but there's some other thing out here that you are claiming, because this is the reason we're here. It's not God, it's some other process. Okay, it has to be greater than man, through which we actually can eliminate evolution, because evolution says you start from the lesser and got to the greater. It has to actually be greater than man in order to produce the effect that we see here. So our question would be, okay, in that process now, what is our natural next question? Let's say it's God, then we're done. God made us here. Let's say it's B2. What's our next question? Where did B2 come from? That's our next question. So do you see what's happening here? Either the omni-God made B2, or there's some other being over here called B3, who's greater than B2 and greater than man, but less than God. He can't be God or greater than God, because then he'd be God. Everybody with me? So he's got to be less than God, greater than us, in order to cause that us to exist. So what starts happening here? Well, then if it's B3, who made B3? And we go to B infinity. And eventually, what is the natural conclusion from this process? What's the natural conclusion? The natural conclusion is God caused something. He is what we would refer to as the first cause. You heard Dink refer to this yesterday. He is the first cause. He first caused something. you eventually get to there's something greater than all of these out there that made them, and that first cause is God. Now what the Bible is going to declare is there's no B2 through B infinity. There's just God and man. God made man. But even if you reason through it, if it's not God, which is what God is saying with Job, if it's not God, then who did it? That's what he's trying to get Job to get through. Well, Job, who made you? So it's got to be greater than Job, but less than me. So who did it then? And that's what he's trying to get him to reason through. This is what we refer to as the first cause. I would reference Hebrews 11, verse 3. Hebrews 3 and verse 4, which Dink referenced yesterday about if there's a building, there has to be a builder. There has to be a first cause that is greater than the thing that happened. Greater than the actual effect. And so greater than man in this case. So once we've acknowledged that God is involved in our existence, at some point God is involved in our existence, we accept what the Bible says He had an immediate cause for our existence. But even just acknowledging that God was involved in our existence, here's our two choices now. Either God chose to communicate with us, His creation, or He chose to never communicate with His creation. Those are two options. Just because you can't have, you're either A or not A, there's nothing left after that. So your options are either He chose to communicate to His creation or He chose not to communicate to His creation. Those are two options. He made us now. Is He going to actually communicate to us? So think about if God never chose to make Himself known. In other words, God made us, but then stepped back and never wanted to make Himself known to His creation. Okay, it's been referenced several times, the concept of deism, where God wound everything up and then stepped back and that's it. He's done. Didn't make Himself known. We would either, in order to find out about God's existence at that point, we would either need to have the ability to find God ourselves naturally. That's one option. If we're going to know about God and God has not revealed Himself, then we need to either have the capacity to find out about God naturally without God's help. Now, Paul's going to say in 1 Corinthians 2, you needed my help. In verse 9, where eye has not seen nor ear heard. But naturally, if I'm going to find out for God just naturally, that's one option. We have to immediately eliminate that as a possibility. And here's why. If God made me, and He made me with the capacity to naturally find Him, what does that mean? Well, that means God wanted to be known by me. Or He wanted us to know Him. If He created with me the capacity to find Him, and then that omni-God who made me had to want us to find Him. So I have to eliminate this from possibility that He made us, didn't reveal Himself, but then gave me the capacity to find Him. I have to eliminate that from possibility because then God made me with the ability to find Him. And we eliminate that from the possibility. It's not an actual option. The other option is we never know of His existence. Either He makes it so we can find out naturally, or we just never know about Him. One of the questions I asked Dink and actually another Chris Jaggy also, two doctors I was talking to yesterday after his vulture lesson. One of the questions that I was wondering was, if you took the vulture immune system and put them in a human, because one of the things he mentioned was their immune system is far greater and far not greater, it's more powerful than our immune system. So my question was, if you put a vulture immune system into a human, would it harm the human, or would it just be excessive? That was the question I asked. Is it just too much? We don't need it. And both of them basically answered with, we just don't need it. It's the same thing with our eyesight, to be able to, or their smell. Can you imagine smelling 12 miles away? I mean, I don't like smelling 5 feet away from some of you. Imagine smelling 12 miles away. It's not that it would harm me, it's that it's excessive. It's not needed for me because I don't scavenge in order to survive. And so what that highlights about our God as a creator is He is not wasteful. He is not wasteful. He makes us exactly the way we need to be made to function the way He intends for us to function. He's not wasteful. So if God made us, then decided I'm never going to let man know about me, that would be wasteful. That is counterintuitive to an omni-God. God is not wasteful. And so I think we eliminate that. Look in Isaiah 45, for example, a verse for that real quick. Isaiah 45. Look with me in verse 19. It'd be wasteful for an omni-God to make something capable of knowledge without ever making Himself known to that thing that can know about Him. In Isaiah 45, verse 19, Isaiah 45, verse 19. He says, I have not spoken in secret in a dark place of the earth. I said not unto the seed of Jacob, seek me in vain. He says, I, the Lord, speak righteousness. I declare things that are right. So notice what God said he did not say. He never said to the seed of Jacob, look for me, but you're never going to find me. I never said seek me, but you're never going to find me. That would be a wasteful God. Hey, you're here. There's some first cause, but you can't find the first cause. That's not the way God behaves. He made us and then wanted us to know about him. That's the way the God of the Bible describes himself. And so he's not wasteful. And in addition to the fact, Revelation 4 and verse 11 tells us exactly why he made us. I know a lot of people are arguing, debating about that. Revelation 4 and verse 11 kind of seals the deal. For his purpose. That's Revelation 4 and verse 11. He made us for his purpose. Now you can argue, you can keep on arguing after that, but what we say is what the Bible says. God, for his purpose, made us. And so we don't have to argue about why we're here. We're here for God's purpose. That's what Revelation 4 and verse 11 says. So that being the case, we will now proceed on the fact, the truth that we know from divine inspiration, but the fact, the truth that God made us and he chose to make himself known to us. That is the fact of God. He not only made us, but then he chose to make himself known unto us. And Scripture is going to uphold that. That is going to involve language. If he's going to make himself known unto us, there's going to be several options. One option being he makes himself known through natural means, for example. So go to Psalm 19 real quick. Psalm 19. And go with me to verse 1. Psalm 19, verse 1. So God could have made himself known personally. And then God could have also made himself known through means. So through means, he could have chosen, for example, a messenger. He could have made himself known through a messenger. Psalm 19, beginning in verse 1, he could also have made himself known through the means of creation itself. Psalm 19 and verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There's no speech nor language where there is the heavens that he's just talking about, the creation. So when I know what the antecedent of that pronoun is, I can go back and understand the heavens, the earth are the voice that he's talking about here. So it's personifying the heavens and the earth. He says there's not a language wherein their speech, the heavens, the earth, does not communicate to us. So God can reveal his existence to us through something outside of language. For example, the language of us studying creation. Where we talked about that in Romans chapter 1. That's one means through which he would do it. But on top of that, what you can't do is walk up to a tree and say, hey, did the Savior die on you? The tree's just going to stand there blowing in the wind. It's not going to communicate divine revelation that we need to be saved. It can communicate his existence. It can communicate, based on Job chapter 38, the fact that God made it. But it can't communicate how to be saved, for example. So we need further divine revelation in order for that to be communicated. That further divine revelation through which anyone who's in this room is saved, you were saved through divine revelation in language. That's how God had to communicate his salvation, was in language. That's the method through which he used. So that's what we're looking at this morning. I wanted to kind of walk through that process to arrive at why we want to spend time on this, because we want to spend time on this because God used language to communicate himself and salvation unto us to be understood. He's not wasteful. So in Acts 26, when the Lord communicates to Saul, he says he did it in the Hebrew language. Go read it up. Acts chapter 26. He chose a language that Saul of Tarsus would understand. Why would he communicate to Saul in gibberish if his whole point of communicating is, you need to be saved? This is the verse that I go to sometimes when I'm in Africa and we're studying the heavenly language of speaking in tongues. And I say, well, let me give you an example of the heavenly language. When God spoke from heaven to communicate to Saul on how to be saved, he used the Hebrew language. I'm not saying the Hebrew language is the heavenly language. I'm saying God used a language that the one who's hearing him would understand. Or else, why would God communicate salvation in gibberish and man not understand? He's not wasteful. He wants man to be saved, 1 Timothy 2, verse 4. So God's going to use a language that man can understand. And we're going to note here that God gave him that language. And God gave him the capacity to understand that language. That's all God given. Okay? So here's what I want to do. I want to begin at the Tower of Babel. We're looking at the divine origins of language. The reason language had to be divine in origin was so that God was going to assure that he could communicate in an understandable way. So one of the things that we don't a lot of times think of is as soon as God creates Adam, what does God do? Well, he gives him commandments, which means there had to be a language that both of them understood, both Adam and God. Adam had the capacity to not only understand, but obey and put that law into practice. He had to have that capacity the moment he was created. And not only that, he had to be able to teach that to Eve, who in Genesis 3 knew exactly what God said, even though she hadn't been created when God gave that commandment. Adam was a patriarch. So he took that message, he understood it, he processed it, he taught it to Eve. They processed it to the point where they said, we're not supposed to touch that tree. That's not what God said, but they processed it to the point of, if we're not supposed to eat that tree, we should probably stay away from that tree, which is a very important lesson we could all learn. Language was from moment number one. The Bible does not reveal to us what language they communicated in. I know it was recorded by Moses in the Hebrew language, but the Bible does not reveal what language God and Adam first started communicating in. I just know they both understood it. But the Bible does not express for us exactly what language that was. We do know, so go with me to the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 11. We do know by Genesis chapter 11, all of the earth was still just of one common language. So whatever language Adam spoke was what they spoke until Babel. In Genesis chapter 11, go with me to verse 1. Genesis chapter 11 and verse 1. The whole earth was of one language and of one speech. So whatever language that was prior to the confusion or the spreading of those languages, it was that same language that Adam had been communicating with God since creation. They were of one language, Genesis 11. Go with me to verse 7. So we know what happens here. They try to build this tower that reaches heaven. And of course, God is going to come down and prevent that from happening. In verse 7, he says, let us, notice the us there, because this is Elohim speaking. Let us go down, and there confound, that's a verb, Belal, B-A-L-A-L. That's the Hebrew verb here. That's where the name of the place is going to come from. Let us confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Because up to this point, they all understood each other. And God says in order to spread, because remember, they were trying to come to one, let's all stay here at one location. What had God commanded them? Not only Adam and Eve, but Noah when he got off the ark. What did God command Noah when he got off the ark? Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And what man decided was, no, we're not going to fill the earth. We're all going to come to one location. So God said, let me help you out then. I'm going to make it so you can't even talk to each other so that you'll keep the commandment I told you when I said to fill the earth. You have to spread out. So what God does in order to accomplish that is he's going to create languages, multiple languages. We're going to see all these demonstrated. In Genesis chapter 10 and verse 25, Genesis 10 and verse 25, we know at what point in the timeline this happens. It says, and unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. So I want to point out that the Bible even specifies what generation under which this Tower of Babel takes place. And so for that reason there, the nations of the Bible that precede. Now, if you go back to Genesis 10 and verse 20, go back to Genesis 10 and verse 20. I want to point this out. These are the sons of Ham after their families, after their tongues. Now, this is something very important about the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is divided into multiple genealogies. The first one, according to Genesis chapter 2, is the genealogy of the heavens and the earth. A lot of people go into this, well, there's one creation, Genesis 1, and there's a separate creation, Genesis 2. No, Genesis 1 spells out for you the elements of the creation. Genesis 2 is the genealogy of that creation. That's what's happening in Genesis 10:11. Genesis 10 makes it sound like, oh, they're already split. No, Genesis 10 is a genealogy. Genesis 11 goes into the description of how they were divided. So you might think of it from the standpoint of Genesis 10 is after Genesis 11. From the standpoint of they were divided in Genesis 10 into these languages. Look at some of the languages here in Genesis chapter 10. So we are approximately about 2269 BC, in the days of Peleg, when this happens, which means from the moment Adam was created to about 2269 BC, don't come up to me and say 2270. I should have just put 2270. That's my fault for putting 2269, because everyone's like, oh, you think you know exactly what year. Somewhere between the moment that Adam was created and around 2270 or so BC, they were of one language. After the Tower of Babel, now the languages divide. God creates every single one of them. God creates every single one of them for the purpose of dividing them, for splitting them, but God creates those languages. So during that first period of about 2,200 years, they have one language. After that, about 2,000 years or so, a little bit less than 2,000 years. After that, we're going to see multiple languages, and that's what Genesis chapter 10 is going to go into. So Genesis 10 is going to be the genealogy of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And what he follows in Genesis 10, because there's the genealogy of Genesis 2, the genealogy of Genesis 5, which is Adam's genealogy, and then now the genealogy of Genesis 10, which is the genealogy of the three sons of Noah. Each of these sons are going to have themselves sons, and each of these sons are going to produce a nation, or they're going to grow into a nation. So you have examples here. So I've given a few examples. I've given, for example, Elam. So in Genesis chapter 10, if you'll go to verse 22, Genesis 10, verse 22, we're looking at Shem's descendants first. In Genesis 10, verse 22, the children of Shem were Elam and Asher and Arphaxad and Lud and Aram. So he goes into the sons of Shem, those who would be descendants of Shem. And I do want to point out here, that's from whom Jesus is going to come. This is the genealogy that's the most important in the Bible, because Jesus is eventually going to come from this descendancy. Elam, for example, was a son of Shem. And I have there that the Elam is going to be to the east of Babylon. The Elamites, the capital city of it being Susa, in Ezra chapter 4, Daniel chapter 2. So we have the Elamites there. They're descendants from Shem. We have Asher. Asher is going to be later translated Assyria. So Asher, and I have the Hebrew word up there, is from where Assyria is going to come. So the language that was going to be an Assyrian language initially was going to come from the descendants of Asher. All the verses are, by the way, in your notes. We're going to go through these quickly. Aram, as you see there, is one of the sons, in verse 22, one of the sons of Shem. Aram and his descendants are going to come to speak what language? Aramaic. That's where we get the Aramaic language from the descendants of Aram. It's translated Syria in other places, Judges and 2 Samuel. It's also settled it's described as settled in the east. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 8. 2 Samuel chapter 8. Just for when you go through the prophets, to be able to recognize these, knowing the city, the capital city of a nation is important. So that way, when you hear Nineveh, you think of what nation? Assyria. When you hear Damascus, what nation do you think of? Syria, okay? So for example, 2 Samuel 8 and verse 5, and the Syrians of Damascus came to succor Hadadezer. So this is when you see Damascus being punished or prophesied to be punished, for example, in the book of Ezekiel or something, just know that represents the nation of the Syrians. They go back to Aram, and we'll get to that Aramaic language here in a moment. Arphaxad, 2 generations after him, is going to be Eber. If you've always wondered where Hebrew comes from, it's from this man. Okay, I know we speak of Hebrews as if those who crossed over, and so we use it in the context of Abraham. Abraham certainly was a Hebrew, and that's Genesis chapter 14. He's the first one called a Hebrew, Genesis 14, verse 13. But it's a descendant of Eber. That's where the word Hebrew comes from. I want you to note there, Eber is the man from which the Hebrew language is going to come. Or that family is going to be speaking that Hebrew language. So it would be divided amongst those. Those are all descendants of Shem. So you have several here. You have Hebrews, Assyrians, Lydians. Lud there is Lydia. Lydians, the Syrians, the Elamites, the Edomites, the Israelites, because the Israelites came from the Hebrews. These are all nations that came from descendants of Shem, and they all spoke languages according to that nation they were part of, that God divided them in. This is Genesis 10, recall. These are called, you may have heard of Semitic, S-E-M-I-T-I-C languages. That proceeds from Shemitic, S-H-E-M, and it just means those who proceed from Shem. And I know critics hate that terminology because they don't want to acknowledge it goes back to Shem. But these are Shemitic or Semitic languages. Our whole Old Testament is written in nothing but Semitic languages. Shem, descendants of Shem. Aram and the Aramaic and the Hebrew language. That's going to be our Old Testament. So there's portions, and I think I remember who mentioned it yesterday, but there's portions of the Old Testament, I think it was Mornay, there's portions of the Old Testament that are written in Aramaic, particularly during the Babylonian captivity. That period there is written in Aramaic, which makes sense. But the largest portion of our Old Testament is written in the Hebrew language. I want us to point out both of them are Semitic languages. Both of them proceed from Shem, descendants of Shem. The Hebrew language and, in fact, the Aramaic language. The importance of the Hebrew language being that's what the Israelites would be speaking. That's the origins of our language of the Old Testament. You then have Ham. There's a lot of them under there. I just want to point out, for example, Mizraim. So go back to Genesis chapter 10. Go back to Genesis chapter 10. And I want to point out, if you back up to verse 6, Genesis 10 and verse 6. So here we have the sons of Ham, and he says Cush, which is going to be later Ethiopia, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. All those are going to develop into nations. Those sons are going to develop into nations. Their families will become nations. The one I want to point out there is Mizraim. It's going to be translated Egypt. From here on out, that word Mizraim is Egypt. In fact, in the Swahili language, which has a lot of ties to the Arabic language, when we go over to Kenya and Tanzania, that's still the word for Egypt. Mizraim is still the word for Egypt. That speaks of the Egyptian people. So the Egyptian people are going to proceed from Mizraim. They would be speaking the Egyptian language. Obviously, the Israelites would have future contact and workings and encounters with the Egyptians. They would proceed from Ham. You see other ones there, the Ethiopians, the Canaanites, the Philistines also would proceed from Ham. Those who speak languages that proceed from Ham are called Hamitic, or what we used to call what the world used to call Hamitic. They don't like to call it that anymore. Now they call it Afro-Asiatic language. So if you hear Afro-Asiatic language, that's the old, that's the new version of what we used to call Hamitic languages, because they proceeded from Ham. That's all that means. They're languages that proceeded from the nations that proceeded from Ham. And then the third one is Japheth, the one I want to point out there as Madai. So if you go to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 2, the sons of Japheth, Gomer and Magog and Madai. Madai is where we're going to get the Medians. So we were talking about in the book of Daniel, the Medes and the Persians. The Medians, that language would proceed from the family of this man who proceeded from Japheth. So that would be a language that proceeded from Japheth. That would be the Median people. But you also have there Javan or Yavan in Genesis 10 verse 2. That's going to be translated later Greek or Grecia. So this is from where the Greeks are going to come, or another word for that being the Ionians. You may see Ionians sometimes. These are all peoples who descended, and their language have descended from this man. Now, obviously, there's going to be a slight crossover because English is not among these languages, so we can all recognize that. There are languages that are going to spring from other languages. So, certain of our language came from Greek. Some of our language came from, Old French. Some of our language came from Old English, not Old English, Old Germanic. Some of our language came from Latin. So, further languages after this are going to develop from these initial languages that God created. So I'm not saying that they all, for 2,000 years, they use the exact same words, because language evolves over time. And as we mentioned, as was mentioned in the hermeneutics class, even the way we use English words today has changed from sometimes the way it was used in the past. So certainly language develops, and I'm not eliminating that fact. I just want to point out where the origins of them are. And most importantly, the fact that God is the originator of them. That's why we're looking at this. God originated these languages. Okay? So you have archaeology. And again, I'm not qualified because I'm not an archaeologist. But all I can do is research the work of other people who do devote their lives to this and put it up here. I think Peyton Reed may be here tomorrow, and he has spent time on those things, far more qualified than I am. But you can go into archaeological discoveries like the Moabite language on the Moabite stone. It's circa the 9th century BC. It's written in this Moabite language. The Moabites descended from who? From Lot. The Moabites descended from Lot. So you can go back to where Lot came from, and you'll know where in fact that language proceeded from. You also have this Egyptian language. This is around 2000 BC. You can go find this actually. I can't remember if this one's in the British Museum or not. But you have the Duaketi, circa 2000 BC. It's in the Egyptian language. How many of you have tried to use a software before to learn a new language? Has anyone tried that before? What software did you use? Rosetta Stone. Most of you probably use the Rosetta Stone software. That just is a name that's given to the software that comes from the Rosetta Stone. Why do you think they chose that as the name of their software? What's the Rosetta Stone have on it? multiple languages. So they're able to come into this language and compare to, oh, this word over here means this word in this other language. And so you have multiple languages on it. It was a very, very important archaeological discovery, the Rosetta Stone is, because it helped them interpret multiple language, us go back and interpret multiple languages that were written down. All these things are important. I just want to point out we have had discoveries of these different languages dating as far back as 2000 BC. It's a very important discovery there. Okay, here's the purpose of this class being in this category. You're asking, well, why does this belong in a category of apologetics? Here's what I want us to all understand. Hopefully this is understandable as far as how it's being presented here. Let me see how much time I got. Okay. I want you to understand, I want you to hear me very clearly. This is not the actual timeline of humanity. Okay? Does everybody hear me? This is not the actual timeline of humanity. Everybody on the video, see my face saying, this is not the actual timeline of humanity. Okay? What this is an evolutionary, and I know that this changes constantly. So don't come to me and say it's 200,000 and not 300,000. Look, I'm not an evolutionist. I have to lean on them to give me what ideas they have currently. This is the one that I found was the most current timeline that evolutionists have for humanity. Okay? And again, this changes constantly. Don't take it up with me. Take it up with evolutionists. There's the pre-human world. Okay? Again, doesn't exist except for 5 days of it. 3 million years, you have the first hominid evolves. And there is a picture of a hominid. He doesn't exist either, but that's an artistic representation of what they believed hominids looked like. Okay? 3 million years ago. That changes and it constantly is in flux. Don't come up to me and say it's 4.6 billion or whatever. I don't know. Ask the evolutionists. This is what they put. Okay, but then 300,000 years ago, the first Homo sapien evolves. This is one thing that we make sure that we understand so we don't misrepresent. You know, I don't care about their feelings, but I don't want to misrepresent. And so when we talk about how old they say humans are, they actually are saying Homo sapiens are around 300,000 years old. And so now we can welcome them into fellowship, right? Okay, so the first Homo sapien, 3,000 years ago, and there's the process in case you didn't know what it looked like. That's how they became a human. They eventually dropped their spear. Okay, 300,000 years ago was the first Homo sapien, okay? Now, this is an evolutionary timeline. 5,500 years ago, this is according to them, not according to me, is the oldest uncovered language that evolutionists have uncovered was 5,500 years ago. This is not me, so don't fight me over it. I love this kind of stuff. I love them being in a quandary that they put themselves in. Well, all we're saying is, so now, what is our initial question? You have a Homo sapien evolving 300,000 years ago. The first language that they have found is not for 5,500 years ago. What's our question then? What happened for the other 295,000 years prior to that? They were just, for another 290-something years before they could finally speak a known language. Is everybody with me? That's the quandary that they are in, not us. The Bible tells us what happened. That's the situation they are in. They don't know how to explain the fact that for 200-something thousand years, a full Homo sapien could not speak to another one. They couldn't figure it out. Listen, babies learn how to speak faster than that. I mean, my less than 1-year-old tells me more. Now, they told me more in different, I think it was Hattie that just claps at us. And like, we got to get rid of her of that one. I don't want her walking around clapping at you when she wants something. But they can communicate at a very young age. Their problem is they couldn't communicate for 290-something thousand years. Do you see the problem that they are in? This is what the problem language presents for them. Now, again, I can only lean on their own words, which is what we're going to do here. I want you to listen very carefully. Now, I'm going to turn. Hopefully this didn't mess things too much up, Ryan, but I want to turn. I want to read this for you. This is out of the Oxford Handbook of Language Evolution. A main challenge in this research is a lack of empirical data. Now, they've already acknowledged something very, very important. What does empirical data mean? 5 senses is what that means. Did I just switch it? 5 senses is what that means. Through their 5 senses, information you can learn from your 5 senses, the data is lacking. You don't say. There are no archaeological traces of early human language. This is the Oxford Handbook. This is not a Church of Christ lectureship book. I'm not putting those down. I'm just saying, I'm not going to a source outside of their own source to prove what they are saying. He says, computational biological modeling and clinical research with, does everybody see that? Artificial languages. What does that mean? Made up language. What have they had to do? Make up languages to try to test things out. They have made artificial languages have been employed by who? By evolutionists, not by Christians. We're not going around, Pentecostals are. They're employing made up languages. But true Christians are not employing made up languages, artificial languages. That's what evolutionists and Pentecostals are doing. Christians are not doing that. It says artificial languages have been employed to fill in gaps of knowledge. So when they have a gap in knowledge, what did they just acknowledge they have to do? Make something up. When they have a gap of knowledge, they have to make something up. That's what they've just acknowledged, not me. I didn't write this. Believe me, I don't have the time. So, although biology is understood to shape the brain, which processes languages, there's no clear link between biology and specific human language structures. Now, what that acknowledges, you can give them 290,000 years, or you can give them 3 million years, and biology cannot result in human language. Does everybody understand what he's saying here, what they are saying here? There's more than one that's written. We're not done with the quotes. They're saying there's no link between biology and specific human language. There's no link there. And so naturally, the Christian is going to say, first of all, duh, but then the Christian is going to say, okay, well then where did it come from? We're back at the beginning again. The language structures are linguistic universals. For a lack of breakthrough in the field, there have been numerous debates about what kind of natural phenomenon language might be. What do they call language, though? A natural phenomenon. So they say we can't explain it. When we have a lack of knowledge, we make stuff up. We know there's no link between biology. But here's one thing we definitely know. We definitely know it was natural. It may be a phenomena, it may be magic, it may be mystical, but it's only natural. Do you see the problem with that mentality? They have to, at the end of the day, because they've eliminated God from possibility, the supernatural from possibility, they have to fall back on, all I know for sure is, before I go to sleep tonight, I have to acknowledge it has to be natural. Go to the book of Jude with me real quick. And then we'll go back to these quotes, I think. Yes. The book of Jude, and I want you to go with me to Jude in verse 10. Jude in verse 10. Now, Jude, the context, as Brother Wacaster mentioned this morning, is false teachers that were already there. In Jude in verse 10, it says, but these speak evil of those things which they know not, but what they know naturally. Does everybody see that word? The Greek word, physikos, physically, naturally. So he's describing these false teachers, that one of the problems that false teachers have is they are only using the empirical data they have collected and things that they can know naturally, physically. But here's what they do even with that information. Listen to what Jude says. But that what they know naturally as brute, I would encourage you to look that word up, alogos, that is illogical. They are illogical, okay? This is not the logical process. The logical process depends on word. They are not logical. So he says here, they're natural, brute beasts. Beast means beasts. It means animals. And that's what he's doing in this context, is comparing them to animals. They are natural, brute beasts. In those things, what do? Even in the things that they collect physically, what do? Corrupt themselves. Does everybody see that? So Dink mentioned this. Dink said, I don't understand how someone who studies biology or is a doctor or something like that studies the human body, I don't understand how they can study that, the physical world, and reach a conclusion there's no God. I agree, but Jude gives us the explanation of it. They have to corrupt themselves in order to do that. Because what they can't do is show up the next day to their college and say, hey guys, I was thinking about the results from our study yesterday, and they can't be explained through natural means. You can't do that, because you'll get fired, lose all your money, and lose your job and lose your community. You may have to actually give something up. But they do this even in what they collect naturally. I want to point that out. Okay, Next quote. Does everybody understand what we're talking about here? This is exactly what they're going to do. Even what they collect naturally, they're going to abuse. Okay, it is suggested that grammar has emerged adaptationally from the human genome. Now this is the Oxford Handbook, the same book that said there's no connection to biology, said it evolved from the human genome. Bringing about a language instinct, an instinct towards language. Or that it depends on a single mutation which has caused a language organ to appear in the human brain. Like if I were writing a book, I couldn't come up with this, and so I'm glad they came up with it because I wouldn't have thought of it. But what they're saying is it was this mutation, and it all of a sudden appeared in the human brain. Which human? I don't know. Somewhere in that 290-something thousand years, eventually a human, all of a sudden, this genome popped into his brain. And can you imagine that poor soul who had the first genome pop into the mutation that popped in his brain, and he's the only one who can communicate, and no one around him can. He's going around saying, guys, can you pass me that dish? And they're going, and he's like, oh, I'm so frustrated. I'm the only one who has this mutation. Okay, this is hypothesized to result in a crystalline grammatical structure underlying all human languages. Now, I'm not a scientist, so you can ask a scientist if genomes are something that can be viewed. Because if they are, you should be able to view this crystalline genome. Again, I may be sounding like nonsense to you doctors, so correct me if I am. Others suggest language is not crystallized, but fluid and ever-changing. Others yet liken language to living organisms. Isn't that interesting? So it's almost like there's life in language. I wonder who put life in language. Languages are considered analogous to a parasite. Now remember, evolution teaches that survival of the fittest, right? Isn't that what we learned when you were younger? The most fit characteristics are the ones that are going to survive, while the least fit we're going to get rid of them. So what's happening with the language is we have evolved a parasite. We've evolved a parasite hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years later, and that parasite has become very, very fit for us as humans, and trees have not evolved it yet. Others yet liken languages to living organisms. Languages are considered analogous to a parasite or populations of mind viruses. We're starting to move into matrix here. And by the way, when I was in college at Texas A&M, I went up to my philosophy teacher, and I was only awake during the first 2 units because it was about evolution. I fell asleep the rest of the class, which I regret now because now that I have 4 children with a 5th on the way, I would have probably enjoyed some of those children lessons. However, I'm sure it was been evolutionary. I went up to my philosophy professor at Texas A&M. I went into his office and I said, I have a question for you. Now, this same professor had presented homosexuality as a genetic evolution, that we are born homosexual. And the evidence he used was 2 giraffes with their necks wrapped around each other. I wish I had not been so poor, because I could have kept that textbook and I could have showed it to you today. But just trust me, I'm not going to hell for anybody, so I'm not lying to you. The picture in the textbook was 2 giraffes, bull giraffes, with their necks wrapped around each other. They say, look, homosexuality is ingrained within biology. Now, the mistake with them was I happened to have gone to Africa 2 times at that point already and been on 2 safaris. And I know that when 2 male giraffes have their necks wrapped around each other, they're beating each other to death for a woman. Go watch it. They have those horns and they're literally just beating each other to death over a woman. They tried to push that in my psychology class, but I went into this man and I said, okay, let's say evolution is true. Is there a next step? Because we're not done evolving, I'm assuming. No, we're not done. And he said to me, and I quote, I'm not going to hell for any of you, have you seen X-Men? That was my philosophy professor at Texas A&M 25 years ago. Have you seen X-Men? And I was waiting for the punchline. I was like, yeah, I have. I was laughing. And then I slowly stopped laughing. He's serious. He thinks that the next step for us is X-Men. I can shoot lasers out of my eyes and everything else that's the next step. There's so far little scientific evidence for any of these claims. Some of them have been labeled as pseudoscience. That's what I label it. I would agree with those people. We're not done yet. A few more minutes. In the last 40 years, there's been an explosion of research on this problem, as well as a sense that considerable progress has been made. A sense of it, even though it hasn't been. We're getting the sense that we're making progress here. We argue instead that the richness of ideas is accompanied by a poverty of evidence. We got all these artificial ideas. We're impoverished by evidence to support our artificial ideas, with essentially no explanation of how and why our linguistic computations and representations evolved. We show that to date, studies of non-human animals provide virtually no relevant parallels. We can't study animals to find them out. I remember when I was in college with Chris Jaggy, they were studying sharks at the time to help with cancer research because sharks are immune to cancer. So sometimes you study animals to determine things for humans. We can't study animals to find out about language. The fossil and archaeological evidence does not inform our understanding until they make something up like they commonly do. And then our understanding of the genetics of language is so impoverished that there's little hope of connecting genes to the linguistic process anytime soon, which is perfect for you because you'll be dead by the time we can come back and say, we're still waiting for that evidence. All modeling attempts have made unfounded assumptions and have provided no... Again, you're about to see the site for this. It's not a preacher of the gospel. These are evolutionists. All modeling attempts have made unfounded assumptions and have provided no empirical tests, thus leaving any insight into language origins unverifiable. No joke. Based on the current state of evidence, we submit that the most fundamental questions about origins and of evolution of our linguistic capacity remains as mysterious as ever. Not one person did this. A whole board of people got together and decided on this one. 0? Does that say 0? Of course it does. Okay, this is my point. If you take the Bible out of situation, you have to look ridiculous. I'm not trying to embarrass, I want to embarrass the doctrine. I'm not trying to embarrass people. But when you fall for that doctrine, it should be embarrassing to you. And if you had just stuck with divine revelation, you wouldn't have been so embarrassed. This is an evidence for the existence of God being the divine origin of language. I think we're out of time. Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone this morning at the Men's Development Conference at BCS Church of Christ. I'm especially excited for the opportunity to be a part of the Texas School of Preaching coming on board. I've done a little bit kind of covering for Brother Rollo this past, at the end of this last year in restoration history. My family and I we got moved in last week. And by moved in, I mean all the boxes are in the house and we have a pathway through the boxes and we're looking for this, that, and other. But the dust will settle. Looking forward to the beginning of the school year, getting into teaching, getting to know the students, and kind of getting my feet down and putting down roots. Our topic for this hour, a history topic, Josephus, eyewitness confirmation of the fulfillment of Matthew 24, 1 through 35. Now, if you're looking for a digital copy of this, I haven't got that turned in yet. I make no excuses. I'll just apologize, but I will get that turned in and get that uploaded. I am always thankful for explanations of difficult passages or figurative language. Have you ever, after reading through a particular passage, felt like the Ethiopian eunuch? And someone saying, hey, did you understand that? And you say, nope, I didn't understand that. I wish I had someone who could help me better to understand that. Well, we have explanations of various texts in Scripture. It's often said the Bible is its own best commentary. We see this with parables. Parable of the sower, the apostles, the disciples, what's the meaning of this? Jesus gives an explanation of that. In fact, Luke chapter 8, verse 11, now the parable is this. Same with the parable of the tares, both of those recorded for us in Matthew chapter 13. Some explanations are simple statements of parables. Luke chapter 18, 9 through 14, the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. Here's the point, here's the lesson. This man went down to his house justified, the one who humbled himself. And so there's no question with regards to particular matters of those parables. It's similar whenever we consider prophecies and their fulfillment. In fact, we're unaware when we read the Old Testament, sometimes we are unaware that certain events or statements are even prophetic until we come to the New Testament. Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, I've called my son out of Egypt. We have no idea that is a prophetic statement referring to the Christ coming out of Egypt, except for the fact that it's recorded for us in the book of Matthew. Isaiah's prophecy, Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, a virgin shall conceive and bring forth a son, thou shalt call his name Emmanuel. Well, we know these things took place that it might be fulfilled. Matthew chapter 1, 26, 22 and 23. Acts chapter 2 and verse 16, giving an explanation for what was taking place on the day of Pentecost. What did Peter say? This is that. When an inspired apostle says this is that, then that's it. We know. We're not left in question. You say, well, why are you talking about all this? The writings of Flavius Josephus, as he is known to us today, have come down to us, and they serve as both an uninspired and I would even say unintentional explanation, a record, an eyewitness of the prophecy of Jesus Christ recorded for us in Matthew chapter 24 and also Luke chapter 21 with regards to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, why do we have the writings of Josephus? How many ancient historians, Roman historians, how many of their writings, how many of historians are there? I just did a quick search online for a list of some of these historians. Here's a very, very brief list. There's Tacitus, Suetonius, Livy, Cassius Dio, Julius Caesar, Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger. We go on and on and on and on. Reputable, notable Roman historians who recorded their time and times before them. How many notable Jewish historians are there? We have Josephus. And there is not another notable Jewish historian until we come to the 1940s. And so I scratch my head and I wonder, why is it the case that we don't have, now we have certainly the inspired record, but why do we not have notable historians, Jewish historians? Well, perhaps and this goes back to the discussion of providence yesterday, right? We'll say, perhaps it is the case that we have the writings of Josephus. They have come down to us providentially as an uninspired eyewitness account of the fulfillment of the prophecies of Jesus Christ. Our purpose for this hour, at least the way I'm approaching this lesson, is to consider Josephus as this and his eyewitness account that we have recorded for us in the wars of the Jews, and relate as much as time will allow us the fulfillment of the prophecy. We'll parallel the record of Josephus and the prophecy of Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 24. Now, what I want to do to get us to that point, I first of all want to introduce just a short sketch of Josephus, who Josephus is. Many of us, perhaps most of us, maybe all of us are familiar with who Josephus is, but we're going to consider him. Then I'll give just a very brief outline of our text, Matthew 24, 1 through 35, just as I have it for this particular study. And then we'll note some of the words of Josephus as they provide for us an eyewitness account, not simply of and not necessarily the destruction of Jerusalem, but of those things that led up to it. To me, that's the more interesting, those events that led up to it. So with that being said, let's consider, first of all, who was Josephus? Well, Josephus was a Jewish historian. He was born in the first year of the reign of the Emperor Caligula, so about the year 37. He was of priestly lineage. Brother Epifanio spoke of the Hasmonean dynasty and the Maccabean revolt. Well, Josephus was a descendant of Mattathias, who was the instigator of that Maccabean revolt in 167 BC. Josephus' father's name was Matthias. He claims in his history that he also is of royal descent. He had royal blood through his mother. His mother's not mentioned. So he is one who has a priestly descent, but also with royal blood. Okay? At the age of 16, he began to study the Jewish sects. In fact, he just began to study just religion as a whole, kind of went on what today someone would call his spiritual journey. And after considering the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, he he chose to associate himself with the Pharisees. And so he is known as one who is a Pharisee. About the age of 26, he made a trip to Rome. Now, we'll throw this in there. At the age of 26, this is going to be about the time that Paul is in prison in Rome. Okay, at this particular time. Well, he makes a trip to Rome also, but he's going on behalf of some priests who had been put in prison in Rome. He either has a contact or he befriends someone, a Jew who is an actor in Rome, and that actor is a friend, has an association with Poppaea, who was the wife of Nero at that particular time, and he has that connection. Poppaea befriends Josephus, and through that relationship and her influence, he is able then to effect the release of these priests in Rome. He stays in Rome for a couple of years. He returns about the year 65 to Judea. And there he sees an environment. He discovers an environment of rebellion. He sees these seeds of revolt. But he's been 2 years. He already knows of Rome. He already knows of the power of Rome, but he's been 2 years in Rome and now has that first-hand knowledge and that experience of seeing the majesty of Rome and the power of Rome. And he does all that he can to dissuade his fellow Jews to forget war, forget revolt. We need to lay down arms and we need to seek for peace. Well, he was unsuccessful. Ultimately, he takes a stand with the Jews, though he never really fully engaged with the Zealots. He never really was a part of that group. In fact, when you read the writings of Josephus in the wars, he'll refer to them as the seditious. He even refers to them as the robbers. Whereas he'll refer to some as the men of power. That would be the high priest and those of the high priest. And that would be the Jewish elite who really wanted peace, but the zealots kept continuing to instigate rebellion. Well, Josephus, he's cited as one who was loyal to the Jews. He ultimately stands with the people. He's given command over Galilee. He begins to build up the strongholds that had been weakened. One of the cities in particular was a city called Jotapata, at which city he ultimately was taken captive by the Romans about the year 67. And so now Josephus is in custody of Vespasian, the general who has been handpicked by Nero after he'd been cast out by Nero, brought back in because nobody else could do the job. And so he is in custody of Vespasian. But Josephus, if nothing else, was a talker. And he tells Vespasian, you and your son, Titus, who is also a part of the Roman armies there, a general, you and your son both will one day be emperors of Rome. Well, Vespasian, true to his Roman roots, and hey, this may be a man who's a prophet, and so we're going to listen to him. Rather than send him on to Rome to stand before Nero, he holds on to Josephus. And in a short period of time, hearing of Vitellius being put to death and his armies declaring him to be the emperor, well, then Josephus is set free at that particular time. Now, just a little bit to give you some idea of the family of Josephus. About this same time, he marries one of the captives. Very shortly, in about a year's time, he'll divorce her and marry a woman from Alexandria, Egypt. And then he'll have one son by her. Hyrcanus, I believe, was his name. In about 5 years, he'll divorce her, marry a Jewess from Crete. They have 2 sons. And so three wives, 3 sons by the last 2 wives. But having been set free, Josephus doesn't say, well, I'm leaving, I'm going to, move to another place. He stays in the company of Titus. And for all practical purposes, becomes a diplomat on behalf of Rome. He's not a traitor. Some people might refer to him as a traitor. He's really someone who loves his country, and he doesn't want to see his country destroyed. He doesn't want to see his people destroyed. He certainly doesn't want to see Jerusalem destroyed or the temple destroyed. He's of a priestly lineage, but he can't convince them. And so ultimately, Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. Josephus, after the war is over, will travel to Rome. He will become a Roman citizen. In fact, Vespasian will commission him to write a history of the war, and he does. We have a record of that. And then he'll spend his later life as a writer, which we have 4 works from Josephus. I'll note those shortly. And an advisor to some of the Roman elite. As far as the writings of Josephus, the Wars of the Jews, written about the year 78, according to the scholars, it's a history of the Jews from the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, mentioned yesterday, to about the year 66, or the fall of Masada, which would have been more about 73. Antiquities of the Jews suggested that it was published about the year 93. It's a history of the Jews from the creation, that to the year 66. An inspired account, certainly, but the account that Josephus provides. Sometime in the years 94 to 99, he writes his autobiography. So we have the life of Josephus. And then sometime after the year 94, it's suggested that Josephus died in the year 100 in the city of Rome. We have no record of the cause of death, perhaps natural causes. But sometime after the year 94, he writes a defense of the Jews, a defense of Judaism, titled Against Apion, who was a Greco-Egyptian speaker, scholar, who had criticized the Jews and the Jewish state. And so he writes a defense of the Jews. Well, this is just a brief sketch of Josephus, this man who we're calling an uninspired and unintentional eyewitness of the prophecies, the fulfillment of the prophecies of Jesus. Let's open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 24. Now let me say this. My purpose is not to give explanation of any of the figurative language or difficult passages here. It's not to try to draw a distinction between the prophecies concerning the destruction of Jerusalem and the prophecy of Christ's return and final judgment. I would suppose that the overwhelming majority of us are able to discern those things ourselves. My goal and my purpose for our time is to lay side by side some of the words of Josephus from the Wars of the Jews and the prophecies of Jesus to give us the historical context, the historical fulfillment of these things as Josephus wrote them down for us, and then and parallel that to the words of Christ. Okay, that's going to be our goal. Now, just for this particular study, just a brief outline that I put together to kind of help me with this particular session. An outline of Matthew 24, 1 through 35. Verses 1 and 2 I call an incredible statement. An incredible statement. And that is after the disciples, and Mark tells us that it's Peter and James and John and Andrew, they are talking about the splendor of the temple. And the temple would hold the Temple Mount would hold anywhere between 70,000 to 100,000 people. It was certainly an incredible work of architecture. Jesus says not one stone will be left unturned. Now that's an incredible statement. And I would suppose that perhaps in the minds of those disciples, the only thing that could bring about the overthrow, the destruction of such a magnificent building that was a building in which God is honored and glorified would have to be the end of the world. And so they then inquire, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming? So we have in verses 1 and 2 the incredible statement. We have in verse 3 inquiring disciples. They want some explanation of this. We started out, we need some explanation on some of these sometimes. Verses 4 through 8, the beginning of sorrows. And that's where we'll begin when we lay Josephus next to these prophecies. We'll start there at verse 4. The beginning of sorrows, and then verses 9 through 14 I refer to as the time of sorrows. Verse 9, we see the death of the saints. Verse 10, offense and betrayal. Verses 11 and 12, false teachers and falling away. Verses 13 and 14, endurance and evangelism. Now, most of that, those words we have record of in the Scriptures. So we won't spend much time on that. Verses 15 through 22, abomination of desolation. Daniel speaks twice of the abomination that makes desolate in Daniel. And we'll note that when we get there. Verses 23 through 26, the false Christ. The false Christ, I have in parentheses, false hopes of deliverance. We understand that whenever the Jews of that time, perhaps same as the mindset of many today, whenever they thought of the Messiah, it was a political saving, a political salvation, a political restoration. That's what they were looking for. Well, these false Christs provided false hopes of deliverance. Then verses 27 through 31, the true Christ. Here we see Rome actually coming in destruction, and so I refer to 27 through 21 as the true Christ. And in parentheses, the true Christ will come in judgment, not deliverance. That's what they will see. And then verses 32 through 34, the admonition. The admonition. In other words, you have been warned, be prepared. That's in essence what Jesus says. And then verse 35, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. The certainty. The certainty. Now, with that brief outline, I want to begin at verse 4 and talk about the beginning of sorrows. I'll read this. We won't necessarily read every section from the Scriptures, but I do want to read this to get us started. Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ. We will talk more about false Christ in 23 through 26. And shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. And that's where I really want to spend much of our time here in this section, wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. The end of Jerusalem is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. Well, let's look at some of the words of Josephus, his record, with regards to this wars and rumors of wars. Well, there were wars among the Jews. You had the rebellious, you had the seditious, you had the robbers, and then you had the men of power, the elite, and those who did not want rebellion. But it was instigated and it was forced through those who were very zealous. I want to introduce you to a man named Josephus Florus. We'll call him Florus. Florus was an agitator of Jewish rebellion. All right, who is Florus? Well, after Felix, and we're going to be able to draw some lines to the biblical timeline. After Felix, a man by the name of Albinus was appointed as procurator of Judea. So it's going to be about between 62 to 64 in this time. Okay, this is according to Wars of the Jews in book 2, chapter 14. Josephus records this of Albinus. Now I say this because you need to understand Florus, what type of man he was. And understand this. Here's what would happen. If the Jews go to Rome and they speak about Florus, his governance is no good. He is not helping to support Rome. He's going to cause rebellion. He's going to cause an uprising. Well, what's the emperor going to do? I need to send somebody. I need to call Florus in, and I need to talk to him and see what's going on. So Florus is going to be doing all that he can to instigate rebellion, to make it look as if anything the Jews might accuse him of, which they will to the governor of Syria, is all false. They're the ones who are trying to instigate everything. Now, that being said, here's what Josephus says of Albinus, who was the procurator before Florus. Okay? Nor was there any sort of wickedness that could be named, but that he had a hand in it. If there's anything that's underhanded, that's fraudulent, well, Albinus had a hand in it. And he lists some. He would steal and plunder the treasures of individuals. He levied burdensome taxes on the nation. He accepted bribes to allow criminals to go free. In fact, Josephus indicated that the only ones in prison were the ones who didn't have enough money to pay, a bribe to get out of prison. Now, that's Albinus. But now listen to what Josephus says. Here's a summary. I think this is important. Josephus sums up the attitude among the Jews under Albinus. At this time were those seeds sown which brought the city to destruction. Okay, now this is just after the time of Felix. And so the seeds are being sown by the heavy hand of these Roman governors. Now, that's enough of Albinus. Notice what he says of Florus. Yet did Josephus Florus, who succeeded him, that is Albinus, demonstrate him, Albinus, to have been a most excellent person upon the comparison. So as bad as Albinus was, Florus was 10 times worse. He was 100 times worse. And when the people appealed to Sestius Gallus, who was governor of the province of Syria, Florus then approached him and said, he convinces him through false statements, everything the Jews are saying is false. Listen, I'm doing a good job. You need to listen to me. And he convinces him, well, it's all the Jews. And he does all this, obviously, to hinder charges against him from reaching Rome. And so what he does then, Florus does, he increases the calamities, any calamities that he can, upon the Jews, simply to try to incite this attitude of rebellion. Okay? So that's where we are. King Agrippa. We recall King Agrippa, Acts chapter 25, 26. He comes with his sister, Bernice, to hear he comes in a visit and he hears the Apostle Paul speak. King Agrippa actively worked to repress Jewish rebellion. In fact, all of those in a place of influence and position at that time did, except for Florus. He was doing everything to undermine. Now, I want to read this a rather long quote from the Wars of the Jews. It's in Book 2, Chapter 16. And this is a statement of Agrippa, okay? Speaking to the Jews, he said, "You are the only people who think it is a disgrace to be servants to those to whom all the world have submitted." You're the only ones who think it's a disgrace to submit to Rome. What's wrong with you people, okay? What sort of army do you rely on? What do you have to back you, okay? What are the arms you depend on? Where is your fleet? What type of a fleet do you have to seize the waters? Where is your fleet that may seize upon the Roman seas? Look at that. Rome not only controlled the land, Rome, the sea, the Mediterranean belonged to Rome. Where are your ships? Okay? And where are those treasures which may be sufficient for your How are you going to afford this? How are you going to pay for this? If you're going to bring people in, where's the money to pay for? You don't have that. Do you suppose, I pray you, that you are to make war with the Egyptians and with the Arabians? Oh, maybe you could sustain yourself against the Egyptians. Maybe you could sustain yourself against the Arabians, but watch this. Will you not carefully reflect upon the Roman Empire? You need to take time and look in the mirror. You need to back up. What did Jesus say? That a king, before he went to war, what should he do? This is what Agrippa's saying. You boys need to back up and see what's going on. You're fixing, my daddy would say, you're fixing to bite off more than you can chew, getting up against Rome. Will you not carefully reflect upon the Roman Empire? Will you not estimate your own weakness? Hath not your army been often beaten, even by your neighboring nations? You can't even take care of the people next door. How are you going to deal with Rome? While the power of the Romans is invincible in all parts of the inhabitable earth. He will go on to say that there are some places where there are thousands upon thousands of citizens and just a handful of Roman soldiers and a governor there to keep things at peace. And nobody else is rebelling. Now, what's this? What remains? This is Agrippa. What remains, therefore, is this. Here's the only hope you have. What remains, therefore, is this, that you have recourse to divine assistance. The only hope you have is your God. That's it. But now what's this? But this is already on the side of the Romans. Your God's on the side of the Romans. For it is impossible that so vast an empire should be settled without God's providence. Well, Agrippa and others, leaders in the area, they worked. They tried to do everything they could to prevent the rebellion. Nevertheless, some of the seditious assaulted Masada, took it. Eleazar, who was the son of Ananias the high priest, Ananias the high priest was in opposition to the rebellion. Eleazar was in sympathy to the rebellion. And so he persuaded many of the priests, that is, Eleazar persuaded many of the priests to receive no gift or sacrifice for any foreigner. What does the Apostle Paul instruct us, 1 Timothy chapter 2? For whom are we to pray? Rulers of our nation and nations throughout the world. Is the ruler of our rulers, are the legislators, are the leaders of our own nation, are they Christians? No, but we should pray for peace so that we can live peaceful lives, that the gospel will have an open door to go forward. Well, this was a similar practice, and this was an ancient practice. This was a custom. But Eleazar convinces it. Now, here's something else. Under the Roman boot, hey, we're good with you worshiping your God as long as you sacrifice, for peace for us. As long as you don't go to your God and try to instigate him against us. Okay? Rome would accept you. He would give you some liberty. They would give you liberties. But Eleazar says, no sacrifices for foreigners, so no sacrifices for Rome, no sacrifices for the emperor. Seeking to stop the rebellion, the men of power, Josephus says. Well, Ananias, the high priest, and the elites among the Jews, they conferred with the high priest and determined to send ambassadors to local kings. And so other provinces, other regions for assistance. But the seditious, here's the quote, but the seditious were strong and withstood, and there was perpetual slaughter on both sides for 7 days. Wars and rumors of wars. And I'll say that over and over. Perpetual slaughter for 7 days. Okay? Well, what's going on? All this is going to go around. What's taking place? Then there's the siege of the Antonia fortress. On the northwest corner of the Temple Mount was the castle of Antonia, or the Antonia fortress. It was a fortress. It was a barracks that would hold about 1,000 Roman soldiers. It was built by Herod when he had the Temple Mount built. He named it after Mark Antony. You know, Herod the Great, whenever Octavius, who would come to be known as Augustus, was going against Mark Antony, who lost. You know who Herod went for? You know who he supported? Antony. And whenever Antony lost, you know what Herod did? He appeals to, he goes to Rome, and he appeals to Octavius, and he says, you know, I never was for Antony. You know where my loyalty is? My loyalty is for Rome. I was supporting Rome. I wasn't supporting Antony. And I'll support Rome still with you. And you know what, Augustus? I don't really have time to deal with Judea anyway. Okay. And so he puts him in place. Well, the castle of Antonia, this barracks from which soldiers run down in the book of Acts to save Paul from being ripped apart. Well, it was besieged and was razed. The garrison was taken, the citadel was set on fire, and then a man by the name of Menahem became the leader of the sedition for a period of time. Now, we're going to see some different names of different people. Some had great success. We're going to see that one particular Roman general, when he comes down and he has Jerusalem, all he's got to do is go knock on the door and they'll let him in. He can take it. But because of false information, perhaps, that's what Josephus suggests, he leaves. And as he's in his retreat, the Jews of the sedition, they just come after. And rather than take all of the effects of war and put them in the middle as they're moving away, they keep them at the back. And some of them they just leave behind. And so the Jews just take them up, and now they've got weaponry. Okay? And we're going to find different men had success. I suggest to you that perhaps, I'll say that again, perhaps it is the case that some of these men were looked to from time to time as this Christ. Hey, we've got a man here who has risen up and he's successful. In John chapter 6, what is it, verse 15? Jesus, when he perceived that they would make him a king by force, what did he do? Answer me this. Why in the world would the Jews want to make Jesus their king? What could he have done for them as a political king? What had he been doing? Somebody read for me Matthew chapter 17. I believe it's verse 11. Let me look, see. I may be off on the wrong chapter. It might be Matthew chapter 11. Give me a second here. Matthew chapter 11. Is it 7? It's when two disciples from John the Baptist are sent. Matthew chapter 11 and verse 5. Somebody read that for me. And remember, the Jews are looking for a king, okay? Somebody, Matthew 11, 5.
The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, and the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached unto them.
All right, look at the miraculous things taking place. Man, the blind see. Any disease is cured. But look at that last one, the miraculous things. The dead are raised up. Man, we've got an undefeatable army here. Man, we go up against the Romans. It doesn't matter how strong they are. Look what this man can do. I'll run into battle, and if I lose my life, it's okay, because King Jesus will come, and he'll just raise us up, and I'll get another shot at him. And so they seek to make him king by force. Well, I would suggest that perhaps here's a man who's being successful in military battle. Here's another man who's being successful in a military battle. And perhaps even some of these men said, I'm the one who's going to lead us to victory over Rome. Don't go chasing after those men. Okay? If they say, well, he's here. If they say, we'll read about one man, if time allows, Niger, who they suppose to be dead, and he's hiding, and he comes up after 3 days of hiding and presents himself, I'm still alive. Well, anyway, Menahem, he becomes leader of the sedition for a little while. And believing himself to be invincible, he becomes cruel. Okay? He becomes barbarously cruel against his own people. He kills Ananias the high priest. Really? Okay. He kills Ananias the high priest and Ananias' brother, Hezekiah. Eleazar and his party, he has his own party, who's the son of Ananias. They assault the party of Menahem then and kill Menahem. And again, wars and rumors of wars. See all these things taking place. Then with Menahem dead, a decision is made to leave off besieging the soldiers. And the Roman general who's in Jerusalem, who's been, locked up, trying to keep himself and his soldiers safe, a man by the name of Metellus, he sends word to Eleazar, hey, we'll lay down our arms if you'll just promise security and let us get out. And Eleazar said, well, absolutely. Hey, we love you, Romans. You just lay them down and come on out. And you know what happened when they came out? Wars and rumors of wars. They killed every single one of them. Well, at the same time all this is taking place, there were above 20,000 Jews in Caesarea who were put to death at the command of, who's the governor at the time? Florus. He's doing everything he can. Well, this cause, then, this slaughter of 20,000, now it's not just the seditious. You have the whole nation now. The spirit of rebellion is catching fire. And so the whole nation of the Jews rebel, and they start to lay waste to villages in Syria, neighboring cities. In fact, Josephus mentions no less than 16 cities that didn't have any part of anything. But they're in the spirit of rebellion. And he says many of the villages that were about every one of those cities were plundered. And they were plundered by the Jews. And an immense slaughter was made of them who were caught in them. The reaction of the Jews then caused those who were Gentiles, hey, we've got to step up against the Jews. In fact, they step up in opposition to the Jews, even those Jews who were opposed to the rebellion. There was one city by the name of Scythopolis, and they were fearful that the population of the Jews who were there, Jews who had who had stated their loyalty to the Romans and had taken up arms ready to fight against their fellow Jews. But those of Scythopolis said, well, we're not really sure. Why don't y'all go out? And they had a particular place they wanted them to go, and y'all stay out there for just a period of time. After 2 days, the men of Scythopolis went out and slaughtered every single one of them, man, woman, and child, cut their throats. About 13,000. And then they plundered all the possessions. Well, wars and rumors of wars. In Ascalon, in Ptolemais, in Tyre, in Hippos, in Gadara, Jews were either killed or they were put into prison. Wars and rumors of wars. Well, I've got what, 7 minutes? 17 minutes? No? Okay. Let's talk about, I want to talk about the abomination of desolation. But here's what I really want to talk about. Let's look at Matthew 24:22, because I want to give some explanation of this. 21, then shall be great tribulation, and if you really want to know the tribulation, the misery, the severity of the destruction, the sufferings of the Jews, read books, 5, 6, and 7, the last 3 books of the Jewish wars, and you'll see the severity of it. But look at 22, except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved, but for the elect's sakes, those days shall be shortened. Now I want to address that. There was a Roman general, Sestius Gallus, who had been in Antioch. Antioch was one of the very few cities that instigated calamities against Rome. Even whenever there was an uprising in all surrounding, they didn't attack the Jewish citizens in their cities. Well, ultimately, Sestius Gallus, Roman general, who'd been in Antioch, he takes a 12th legion, he takes additional troops from other legions, and he moves southward toward Jerusalem. Ultimately, what have I got, 5? 5, okay. Ultimately, he comes they take this place, this place, this place. They put people out. He sends one of his generals with some of the legions up to Galilee, and they put them down. Well, now they come to Jerusalem. And at the time, Jerusalem, it was right. It was ready to take, because here's what had happened. The seditious, the rebellious, they thought, we can't do this. We might as well throw in the towel. And those who were in opposition to the rebellion, they said, hey, let's let the Romans in. Let's just we're ready to let them in. We want peace. Sestius Gallus did not realize the attitude both of the rebellious and of the peaceful. And Josephus suggests, because of false information, false intelligence given by Florus, that Sestius Gallus pulled his troops back from Jerusalem. Now, here's the quote. It happened that Sestius was not conscious either how the besieged despaired of success, that's the rebellious, nor how courageous the people were for him, that is, those who opposed the rebellion, and so he recalled his soldiers without any reason. There was really no reason to do that. Well, this unexplained pulling back of the Roman troops afforded opportunity for those in the city to flee. And if I'm not mistaken, if memory serves, the historian Eusebius said that not a single Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. Why? Well, because of the prophecy of Jesus Christ. I think Hebrews chapter 10, 24 and 25 also has something to do with that in verses following. The Hebrews writer reminding them to come together to remind one another of the things concerning the Christ. Well, we don't have time to get into other things. I appreciate the opportunity. I love history, especially any type of a history, the secular history that can be related and tied into Bible times, especially that history that has to do with ancient Rome. Appreciate the opportunity to speak this hour, and I'll try to do it by the end of day to have this information to the email that I need to have it to, so we can get that uploaded, and you'll have access to that. Thank you for your time.